Chapter 4. Worship. Oh, come let us worship and fall down before Christ. In the early centuries of the Church, the procession with the Gospel book into the altar was the first movement of the Divine Liturgy. For a period, in Constantinople and in Old Rome, the bishop, the clergy, and the faithful would process to a church for Divine Liturgy. Arriving at the church where the liturgy was to be celebrated, the bishop, with the Gospel, and clergy would process into the altar and the people into the nave singing, "Oh, come let us worship and fall down before Christ." When the Gospel had been placed on the altar and the people were gathered in the nave, worship began. We no longer process to the church for the liturgy, and the little entrance is no longer at the very beginning of the Divine Liturgy, but occurs after the Great Litany, the three antiphons and the Little Litany. Nonetheless, the theological significance of the little entrance remains. As the Gospel book is lifted up by the deacon before the royal doors and the priest prays that the holy angels might accompany the faithful as they enter into worship, we are reminded that he who descended is also the one who ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. Christ, the incarnate God, has become our eternal high priest, has entered the tabernacle not made by hands and abides for us in the presence of God. Christ, then, is the celebrant of the liturgy in which we participate when we come to church. He brings us up into heaven with him so that we may eat and drink with him, may feed on him, in his kingdom. But what does it mean, for us and for God, that we seek communion with Christ, that we worship? Worship. God and worship. The most important thing one can say about worship is that God doesn't need it. God is the source of all life, beatitude, and joy, the one who is without beginning, who is changeless, and who is never moved by necessity or need. We worship because we need to worship, not because God needs it. God is self-sufficient, he doesn't need anything. Though this might be taken for granted by many now, it was not the way the ancients thought. In the ancient Near East, for example, men lived with the gods in a kind of symbiotic relationship. They took care of the gods' needs, offering sacrifice and tending their temples, and the gods in turn took care of them, blessing their crops, and giving them prosperity and peace. Each needed the other. In fact, in the creation stories of the ancient Near East, the gods created mankind to do the work they no longer wanted to do. And in the ancient epic of Gilgamesh it is said that when a sacrifice was finally offered again after the flood, the gods swarmed around it like flies, hungry because no sacrifices were offered during the time of the flood. It was otherwise for the God worshipped by Israel and the Christians. The whole notion that God needs our worship and our sacrifices is decisively and derisively dismissed in such works as Psalm 50. In this psalm, Yahweh speaks to his people and declares he does not need their sacrificial animals, for every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and all that is in it is mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls, or drink the blood of goats? Here God ridicules the idea that he is enriched by sacrifice or that he could need anything from men. The rebuke is right to the point of sarcasm. If God really wanted meat, he would hardly wait to be served it by Israelite priests. What he really wants from his people is not meat, but gratitude and righteous relationship. Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you and you shall glorify me. This demand for righteousness of life is all important, so much so that if it is lacking, God not only doesn't need our worship, but more than that, he will not accept it. When Israel practiced injustice with the rich grinding the face of the poor, the prophetic rebuke was stunning. God thundered to Israel, "What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls, or of lambs, or of he-goats. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring no more vain offerings, incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of assemblies, I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates, they have become a burden to me, I am weary of bearing them." One could scarcely get further away from the concept of a divine-human symbiosis that governed notions of religion in the pagan world. Worship is important not because God needs it, but because we do. Yet our worship must be the offering of a righteous life, a life itself offered in love to God. If we withhold our love from God and turn our backs on Him, if we walk in a way He hates and live lives of unrighteousness, our worship is not acceptable to Him. In biblical thought, sacrificial worship and ethical living are inseparable, and the former must flow from the latter. Otherwise, our sacrifices will be spurned as the offerings of hypocrisy. They will not result in our drawing close to God and our union with Him, but in our condemnation. This was the consistent message of the prophets. Has Yahweh as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying Yahweh's voice? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice. Shall I come before Him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what does Yahweh require of you, but to do justice and to love loyalty, and to walk humbly with your God. To worship Him truly we must first love Him and show our love in humble obedience and righteousness. Otherwise, our worship is a sham. Man and worship. Human beings were created to run on transcendence in the same way that cars were first designed to run on gasoline. Pouring other liquids into the gas tank, while it might be cheaper than gasoline and thus tempting to use as a substitute, would not work, because its use would be contrary to the way the car was designed to function. To say that human beings were designed to live transcendently means that we were created to be worshippers. This is one of the things which separates human beings from the animals. Animals do not worship as human beings do. That is not to say that animals have no relationship with God. The psalmist tells us that the lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God, Psalm 104 verse 21, but this relationship does not include voluntary acts of worship, acts which can be given or withheld. Human beings, alone in the visible creation, were created to offer free and voluntary worship to the Creator. It is when human beings reach up to God in worship, gratitude, supplication, and love that the rest of our lives can exist in harmony. We were created to be upwardly and dynamically open to God, open to the constant infusion of His life within us, participating in His power and energies. This happens when we turn to Him in worship. When we do not do this, He cannot pour His life into us, and we wither up and die. Turning from God and refusing to worship results in our death, not because God will kill us if we refuse to worship, but because it is only through worship that His life is continuously given to us. A flower only lives when it is rooted in the soil and open to the sun. If it pulled up its roots or refused the sunlight, it would wither and die. It is the same with us. This has always been the teaching of the Church. St. Augustine once wrote in his Confessions that, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Rather more recently Father Alexander Schmemann wrote in his For the Life of the World that, all rational, spiritual, and other qualities of man, distinguishing him from other creatures, have their focus and ultimate fulfillment in this capacity to bless God. Homo sapiens, Homo faber, yes, but first of all, Homo adorans. This means that the refusal to put God in the center of our life by worshiping Him can only lead to inauthentic human life and ultimately, spiritual death. Man as Homo sapiens, who puts the search for wisdom and knowledge at the center of his existence, man as rationalist, cannot satisfy the human heart or lead to life. Man as Homo faber, the builder, the manufacturer, who puts the building of monuments, tools, technology at the center of his existence, man as empire builder, cannot satisfy. It is only when man knows himself to be Homo adorans, the worshipper, the creature that finds its freedom and joy in God, that true peace and true life can be found in the world experience harmony. It is because the human race has turned from the living and true God and, as a race, has refused to worship Him that troubles befall us. Being created for transcendence, we will worship something, even if not the true and living God. We will not live like the animals, eating, breeding, and dying, worshiping nothing at all. If we refuse to worship the living God, we will find other substitutes for Him. This is why St. Paul spoke at length about the fundamental problem in the Gentile world being one of idolatry. Mankind is a race of idolaters, and therefore we experience spiritual death. We refuse to worship the true God and exchange His glory for the fading glory of something else, anything else, things that cannot save or give life. That is the ultimate and true cause of the wars and the crime that constantly afflict our planet. We are at war with the true God, and therefore are at war within ourselves and with one another. Having refused to worship God, nothing else in our existence works as it was designed to. The idols currently worshipped in the secular West are not the physical idols worshipped in the religious society of ancient Rome or present-day India. Whatever we choose to make ultimate in our life is our idol, which is why St. Paul defined covetousness as idolatry. The most favored idols worshipped in the secular West today are wealth, health, and sexual pleasure. In the tradition of the Bible, worshiping the true God involves renouncing and shunning all idols, and turning to find our true life, peace, and joy in God alone. That is, worshiping God involves constant repentance, and continually turning away from the idols that lay claim to our affections and priorities and clinging to God as our only source of life. In this fallen world, false idols clamor for our attention and devotion, and true spirituality consists of continually turning away from their siren call and turning again and again to the true God. Man must worship this true and living God if he is to find life and live in harmony with himself, with others, and with the world around him. True worship is thus built upon the foundation of repentance and inner vigilance. Individual and corporate worship. Because human beings are social animals as well as individuals, worship has both individual and corporate components. That is, one can worship God when alone, and can also worship God as part of a group. Personal worship. Worship as an individual involves offering personal prayer. Christ stressed that such prayer must studiously avoid being done for show, for the real purpose of exciting the admiration of those who might be watching. For this reason, he said that rather than pray one's personal prayers in public under the watchful eye of those passing by, his disciples should offer their personal prayers in privacy, far from the possibility of watchful eyes and applauding hands. He instructed his disciples, "When you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." The word here rendered room is the Greek tamion, and means not just any room but a hidden, secret room, a storeroom in the inner recesses of the house. Christ was saying that his disciples should take care not to be seen praying their personal prayers, lest they earn the applause of others and thereby forfeit their reward from God. The importance of such personal prayer may be gauged by the abundance of prayer books containing such prayers, and the Church's expectation that the pious Orthodox Christian will pray both in the morning and the evening. Usually, such prayer is offered at one's icon corner, a place selected and dedicated to prayer, and containing such things as one's Bible, prayer rope, or other devotional aids. Reading the scriptures usually accompany such prayer as part of one's discipline and prayer rule. Yet even when we are alone in our prayer corner, we are still members of Christ's body, praying the Our Father, not the My Father. The prayers we use are taught us by the Church, and we pray privately at home because we have first prayed as a body in church. That is why the prayer books for personal use consist of prayers gathered from the corporate services of the Church. Both our private prayers and our corporate worship constitute a single offering of our life to God. Corporate worship. Worship also includes corporate prayer as part of a larger group. In Israel, God appointed set times for such corporate gatherings. Though one could come to the central shrine where the ark was situated and offer sacrifice any time, the Torah mandated that all Israelite males must gather at the shrine 3 times a year, for the feast of Passover, for the feast of harvest, and for the feast of the ingathering. These gatherings foreshadowed the weekly gatherings of Christians on the Lord's Day, when they would gather together for the Eucharist as the body of Christ. The Hebrew term for a gathering or an assembly is kahal. It is translated in the Greek Septuagint as ecclesia. The word ecclesia, however, doesn't necessarily imply the gathered community of Christians, or even a religious gathering at all. In Acts 19 verse 41 the term a gathering for civil purposes, as when many angry citizens gathered to protest the work of Paul in a kind of town hall protest meeting. When used of Christians it refers to the assembling of all the Christians at an agreed-upon location for the purpose of prayer and for the Eucharist. A church is by definition a gathering, an assembly, the result of what happens after people gather and assemble. After becoming a convert to the Christian faith through baptism, one was expected to gather with them for worship every Sunday, to be present at the Lord's assembly. The Lord Jesus pledged his presence there among them, even if the assembly consisted of a small group of 2 or 3 people. It is this presence of Christ that constitutes the essence of the church, and what makes a gathering of Christians to be church. From the earliest days, these Sunday gatherings consisted of listening to the apostolic teaching, mutual sharing, breaking bread, and the prayers. By the end of the 1st century, the Eucharistic sharing of the Lord's body and blood had become detached from its original context as a full meal or supper, and was held in the early morning, while fasting before the first meal of the day. It was later in the day, after the workday had concluded, that the Christians were reassembled for a love feast, the agape meal. The structure of the Eucharist was recorded by St. Justin Martyr in his first apology. Its main elements were, 1. The reading of the Scriptures. 2. An instruction explaining its meaning. 3. Intercessory prayers for all the world. 4. The exchange of the kiss of peace among the Christians. 5. The prayer over bread and wine. 6. The partaking of the bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. Different groups of people had different assigned tasks in this gathering, with bishops and deacons, for example, each having their distinct roles. In its essential form, this is still the underlying structure of the Divine Liturgy to this day. Weekly participation in this gathering defined a person as a part of the Christian people, the Church. No one who deliberately and voluntarily absented himself or herself from this gathering was considered a Christian. A Christian was defined, both by the Church and by the Roman state as well, not as someone who believed certain things about God or Christ, but as someone who joined in gathering for the Eucharist. A Christian was, by definition, a worshipper, someone who gathered with other Christians to worship Christ. That is why if someone betrayed the Christian faith through their behavior and was clearly no longer a disciple of Jesus, they were excommunicated, i.e., excluded from the Eucharistic gathering. The Christian was one who centered his entire existence upon Jesus Christ and lived to worship him. This was done privately, whether at home or on the road, and in the gathered assemblies of the Christians as God's ecclesia. It was through this constant worship of God that God poured his life and power into his redeemed creature, bringing salvation and joy. Worship, spiritual and physical. This worship had a physical component to it, since the worshipper is an amalgam of flesh and spirit. If human beings were only spirit, like the angels, and consisted only of mind and intellect, worship would have no bodily components, but would be the bodiless adoration of the invisible God, a mind seeking the mind. But in fact, humans are amphibious. Just as amphibians live in both water and on land, so human beings live both in the world of the physical senses and the world of the spirit. Therefore, our worship partakes of both qualities, and is both spiritual and physical. The spiritual component is the more obvious one to us moderns. Prayer and worship mean not simply reciting syllables, which we may or may not understand. It involves the understanding, the nous, the inner capacity for receptivity and relationship. At times the Greek word nous is somewhat misleadingly translated as mind, giving the impression of an entirely intellectual component. But the nous involves more than just the intellect. It includes the interior ability to absorb and receive. That is why worship must be conducted in a language which is understood, so that the words uttered are expressions of the relationship between the worshipper and the Lord. For this reason, St. Paul insisted that words openly spoken in an unknown tongue in the congregation be interpreted and translated. Ultimately, our prayers are spiritual, the fruit of the Spirit within us, praying within and causing us to cry out, Abba, Father. They are not solely our own creation and work, but the combination of the Spirit's work within and our own yearning after God. But our prayers and worship have a physical component to them as well, since what we do with our bodies affects and souls and spirits also. We stand for prayer and worship, though one can pray upon one's knees or can prostrate if one's prayer is fervent. In prayer one usually lifts up one's hands and eyes to God. Similarly, One can make deep bows from the waist or even a prostration as one offers prayers. One also makes the sign of the cross at the conclusion of prayers, which finish with a mention of the Holy Trinity. Such physical actions are bodily prayers, as one worships God with the body as well as the mind. The whole person, the inner self and the outer self, is involved in lifting oneself up to the Lord. It is this principle which is fully and savingly expressed in the sacramental mysteries and rituals of the Church. The Church uses physical things such as water, bread, wine, and oil, things made spirit-bearing by the command and authority of Christ, to produce spiritual results. Salvation involves sacraments because all life is sacramental, consisting of physical things charged with spiritual significance and power. The Liturgical Year. The creation of the Church calendar. The Church's liturgical worship is spread throughout the year, finding expression in the use of a calendar to regulate the observances of the Church's feasts. This is because Christian worship is corporate as well as private, and so if Christians will celebrate Christ's birth, they must first agree upon which date that celebration will take place. If Christian worship were merely individual, then different individual Christians might choose to celebrate Christ's birth on differing days, with no loss. But since our worship is corporate, a calendar becomes necessary if feast days and other special occasions are to be kept. At first there was no such thing as a liturgical year, and no specifically Christian calendar, so that no calendar can claim apostolic provenance or authority. The apostles simply mandated the gathering together of all the baptized in a weekly kahal or ecclesia. It was on this day that all the Christians within a given locale would meet to hear the word and offer the Eucharist. This gathering anticipated the age to come and was the Christians' weekly experience of the power that would flood the world in that age to come. There was, in other words, an eschatological dimension to the Christian sacramental gathering. This eschatological gathering was the sole Christian calendar known to the apostles. Very soon, however, martyrdoms began to multiply. The local church would treasure and celebrate their local martyrs, meeting on the anniversary of his or her martyrdom to rehearse those glorious events and celebrate the Eucharist, ideally, over the grave of the martyr. These annual celebrations of the martyred saints became the next layer of celebrations added to the apostolic gatherings on Sunday. As the stories of the martyrs became more widely known, the feast of the martyr might be celebrated not just by the community in which the martyr had lived and died, but by other church communities as well. Around this time, in the 2nd century, the Church began to also celebrate annually the death and resurrection of Christ. Some churches celebrated this feast on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, the day when Christ was crucified, regardless of whether or not that day fell on a Sunday. Many other churches, such as those of Rome, celebrated this feast always on a Sunday, regardless of whether the day was the 14th of Nisan. Such diversity of calendar and practice was not considered problematic by those such as Saint Irenaeus, who urged the Bishop of Rome to relax and not break communion with those who celebrated it on the 14th of Nisan as he was tempted to do. But after the Council of Nicaea in 325, such diversity was becoming pastorally problematic to the perception of the Church's unity in the eyes of the world, and a formula was agreed upon: the Feast of Pascha would be celebrated by all churches on the Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. Those insisting on the date of the 14th of Nisan now had to conform or leave. Soon other feasts were added, such as the Feast of Epiphany, i.e., the manifestation of Christ's glory, seen at his birth, at his revelation to the Magi, at his baptism, and at his miracle of turning water into wine. This feast was held on January 6. Eventually the West decided to commemorate Christ's birth on December 25, drawing the events of his birth and the visit of the Magi away from its original feast in January to the new one in December. Feasts were added at different times and in different places. Eventually certain calendars came into widespread use, so that today all the Orthodox world uses the same church calendar for feasts. This calendar contains a number of saints' days, commemorating various saints, and a number of feasts celebrating events in the life of Christ and the life of Mary the Theotokos. The 12 Great Feasts. In Orthodoxy today, there are feasts of the Lord and feasts of the Theotokos. The feasts of the Lord are the Elevation of the Cross, Nativity, Theophany. Palm Sunday. The Ascension. Pentecost. And his Transfiguration. The feasts of the Theotokos are, the Nativity of the Theotokos, the Entrance, the Meeting, the Annunciation and the Dormition. These feasts are 12 in total. There are other feasts as well, but these are especially important to the Church's liturgical life. A close reading will reveal that some of the feasts are attached to the solar calendar, while some are part of the Paschal cycle, which is dependent upon the date of the full moon after the spring equinox. The names and dates for the 12 great feasts are: 1. Theophany, January 6th. 2. Meeting, February 2nd. 3. Annunciation, March 25th. 4. Palm Sunday, 1 week before Pascha. 5. Ascension, 40 days after Pascha. 6. Pentecost, 50 days after Pascha. 7. Transfiguration, August 6th. 8. Dormition, August 15th. 9. Nativity of the Theotokos, September 8th. 10. Elevation of the Cross, September 14th. 11. Entrance of the Theotokos, November 21st. 12. Christmas, December 25th. It will be noted that Pascha itself is not a part of the 12 great feasts, since it is considered too important to be one feast among many. Rather, it is regarded as the Feast of Feasts, the source of everything else. Fasting periods. As well as the feasts, there are 4 fasting periods during the liturgical year. 1. The Great Lent, beginning 40 days before Pascha, with a pre-Lenten series of Sundays preceding it. 2. The Fast of Saints Peter and Paul, or the Apostles' Fast, beginning a week after Pentecost and ending with the Feast of Peter and Paul on June 29th. 3. The Dormition Fast, beginning August 1st and ending with the Feast of the Dormition on August 15th. 4. The Nativity Fast, beginning November 15th and ending 40 days later with the Feast of Christmas. The fasts are of varying strictness, with Great Lent being the strictest of all. They are also of varying lengths. The Great Lenten Fast is 40 days long, plus Holy Week after that. The Nativity Fast is 40 days long, the Dormition Fast is 2 weeks long, and the Apostles' Fast is of varying length, dependent as it is upon the varying date of Pentecost. Regarding the Apostles' Fast, after Pentecost there is a fast-free week when fasting is disallowed, so that the Apostles' Fast cannot begin until after that fast-free week is over. But regardless of when the Apostles' Fast begins, it must end with the Feast of the Apostles Peter and Paul on June 29th, which means that some years that fast is very long, while other years it is very short. That is why most parishes offer a church calendar to their faithful, so that such things can be easily learned. Experienced Orthodox, upon receiving their new calendar in January, usually immediately look up the month of June to see how long the Apostles' Fast is going to be that year. The liturgical year therefore consists of an alternating series of fasting and feasting, the former being a preparation for the latter. Old calendar and new calendar. Often there is some confusion about the dates of the Church's feasts due to the question of old versus new calendar. Many of those using the old calendar, for example, believe that Orthodox Christmas is on January 7th, because that is the secular date on which that feast is celebrated by those using the old calendar. What is the old calendar? The old calendar was the secular calendar used in Europe from the time of Julius Caesar until fairly recently. Calendars are difficult things to work out precisely, since they require knowledge of astronomy. The old Julian calendar was only a bit off in its astronomical calculations, but with the passing of centuries it grew ever more off and inaccurate to the point where it is now 13 days off. If not adjusted and corrected, eventually December 25th Christmas would be held in the spring or summer. People in society agreed that changes to the calendar needed to be made. The only people having the astronomical skill to make the changes and correct the calendar were those of the universities of Europe. Eventually they produced a more accurate calendar. Since the universities did their work when Pope Gregory was ruling the Roman Catholic Church and influencing the Catholic universities of Europe, the new calendar was sometimes called the Gregorian calendar. One by one the countries of Europe and beyond accepted the new revised calendar and used it for their daily life. The question, of course, was what the Church should do with its own feasts. It was used to celebrating Christmas on what was now January 7th. Now that the calendar had been adjusted so that Christmas December 25th was now accurately found at the end of December, should the Church adopt the secular calendar as the basis for its own feasts? That is, should the Church cling to an old secular calendar that was acknowledged to be no longer accurate as the basis for its own ordering of feasts? Or should it use the new corrected calendar as the basis for its ordering of feasts? In this question of church calendar, it is important to realize that the Church's concern is with feasts, not with astronomy. Theologians lack the necessary skill to adjust a calendar, and it is not their job. The Church's job is to decree when it will celebrate Christmas. It has decided that it will celebrate Christmas on December 25th. Determining exactly which day is December 25th is not the task of the Church, but of the astronomers with the skill to produce accurate calendars. In other words, the Church calendar is a grid that it places over the secular calendar, to decide which feast will be celebrated on which day. It is a confusion of tasks to suggest that the Church's job is to decide which calendar is more accurate, that is the job of the astronomers. The Church, in fact, never committed itself to a single secular calendar, but placed its festal grid over whichever secular calendar was in use. No council, for example, mandated the use of the older Julian calendar, including the Council of Nicaea. That council simply said that all Christians should celebrate Pascha on the same date, and that the formula for determining that date was that it should be on the first Sunday after the full moon after the spring equinox. Some churches use the old calendar, while others use the new calendar. This means that, for example, Orthodox Christians in Greece celebrate Christmas December 25th on the secular date of December 25th, while the Orthodox in Russia celebrate Christmas December 25th on the secular date of January 7th. Note, both groups know that Christmas is celebrated on December 25th. The disagreement centers upon exactly when it is December 25th. No Orthodox Church asserts that the date for Christmas is January 7th. And all Orthodox use the new Gregorian calendar in their secular lives, because that is what society around them does. It is important to remember that all of this concerns only the solar calendar, which regulates the fixed days of celebration. Because of the importance of Pascha, for the sake of unity, even the churches using the new Gregorian calendar still keep to old Julian calculation for Pascha, i.e., the Julian date for the spring equinox, so that whatever calendar is used to keep the feasts such as Christmas and Theophany, all Orthodox churches will keep the same Paschal cycle, using the same dates for Great Lent, Pascha, and Pentecost. When the Holy Fire descends each year in Jerusalem on Holy Saturday, this is the date used by all the Orthodox. The question of which secular calendar is preferable and over which one the Church will place its festal grid is one of comparatively minor significance. In the OCA, for example, some congregations use the old calendar and some use the new, with no loss of love or unity. However, not all who use the old calendar agree that the question is of minor significance. Some who use the old calendar regard use of the new calendar as very significant, indeed, in that they regard it as a form of compromise with the world, motivated by extreme ecumenism, and a sign of apostasy. These people are called old calendarists. This can be a bit confusing, since not everyone using the old calendar is an old calendarist, who believes the use of the new calendar is a sign of apostasy. The schism between old calendarists and the rest of the Orthodox Church remains. Ultimately, the issue separating them is not about calendar itself, but about the Orthodox Church's relationships with those outside. The liturgical week. Every day in the week has its own liturgical theme, some of them tied to the life of Christ. Thus, Sunday focuses upon the theme of Christ's resurrection, while Friday focuses upon the theme of his cross. Saturday, the Sabbath, recalls the time when Christ rested in the tomb, and so the theme for the day focuses upon the departed who rest in the tombs. The days and their respective themes are: Sunday, the resurrection of Christ; Monday, the angels; Tuesday, St. John the Forerunner; Wednesday, the Passion of Christ, his betrayal, also the Theotokos. Thursday, the Apostles and Saint Nicholas. Friday, the Cross. Saturday, the Departed and the Martyrs. As in Judaism, the liturgical day begins with the previous evening, so that Saturday evening Vespers focuses upon the resurrection of Christ, as do the services on Sunday morning. Sunday evening, however, belongs liturgically to Monday, and so focuses upon the angels, as do the services on Monday morning. These themes are reflected in the liturgical hymns written for the days of the week, especially for the services of Vespers and Matins found in the Octo Echoes, the book containing the hymns for the 8 tones. The liturgical day. Each day, especially in monasteries, is punctuated by periodic prayer. The notion of stopping to pray throughout the day is as old as the Didache in the late 1st century, which suggests that Christians stop and say the Our Father 3 times a day. Eventually set services were produced, centering upon fixed units of 3 psalms. In this system one could pray at the first hour of the day using the set psalms and prayers, then again at the 3rd hour of the day using different psalms and prayers, then again at the 6th hour, then again at the 9th hour. Vespers would be prayed at sunset, and then one would pray again before retiring, so-called compline, from the Latin completorium, the service which completed the day. Then after a sleep one would arise in the wee hours of the morning to pray for a long time and chant psalms. That service is called matins, i.e., the morning service. In this system one stops to pray 7 separate times, hearkening back to the psalm verse which says, 7 times a day do I praise you. In its original context, 7 times was simply shorthand for often and continually. These services are known as the hours or the divine office. In practice, because of the difficulty of stopping one's activity so often, the services are often gathered together into 2 separate groups and prayed in the morning and in the evening. Thus, some monasteries meet in the morning, when they pray the 3rd and 6th hours and then the Divine Liturgy, all without a break. Then they meet again later in the afternoon, when they pray the 9th hour, Vespers, Matins, and the 1st hour. Compline is prayed privately and separately by the monastics in their cells. Such a combination of different services into one longer service is done in parishes as well at times of feasts. For example, at Christmas time, all the hours are combined into one service called the Royal Hours. One does wonder a bit about the practice of combining the separate services into one long service, given that the original purpose of the services was to punctuate the hours of the day with prayer, stopping to pray every few hours, and sanctifying the 6th hour of noon by praying at that time. Time cannot be sanctified in advance, for that is what time means. The author of the Didache intended his readers to stop 3 times throughout the day to say the Our Father and thus offer those various times to God. Stopping only once to say the Our Father 3 times in a row would not have served the same purpose. It is apparent, then, that practicality sometimes takes precedence over principle. But it is a good thing to remember God as often as one can, stopping to offer prayer. The Our Father, for example, is short enough to be said often throughout the day. It is a very portable form of worship. Conclusion. As God's children, Christians draw their entire purpose and life from God. We know that continuing to live means continuing to make worship the foundation of everything else. In this life we strive to make all that we say and do an offering to Him. As members of His Church, as the royal priesthood, as the linchpin of creation, we are called to be the voice of all visible creation, giving thanks to God on behalf of all. As His priesthood, we offer the world back to Him, beginning with ourselves, as incorporated members of the body of Christ. Christ alone offers the full, true, and acceptable worship. It is because we are in Him, and are His body, that our worship also partakes of that fullness, that truth, and is accepted by the Father.